All right, our next panel is Your Port Protected, Cybersecurity for Ports of All Sizes. And I am very pleased to introduce the moderator. It is Rigo Cisneros. Rigo is the director at Global Advisory. Jacobs is a senior strategist, systems integrator, and program leader with more than 25 years of experience advancing infrastructure modernization, community resilience, and national defense readiness. And Rigo will be introducing the rest of the panel. And here he comes.
Yeah, I got this.
Okay.
Perfect.
Take it away.
Sounds good. Half a day, everybody? Half a day. Maybe I don't need this, but all right, there we go. Yeah, so really excited to be here. Really excited for this panel. I think that let me start by saying you're going to see a lot of me this morning. So I'm going to do this session, then the next one, then we'll take a break, and then I'll be back and then finish the last session. But it's because they're all interconnected. So very quickly, let me introduce our panel for today because we have a very short amount of time and I think we got a lot of stuff to cover. So first is Andre Khalili, who is our Deputy Director for Hawaii Department of Transportation. She's been in that role since December of 2022. She oversees Hawaii's commercial port system, which is 10 harbors under one portfolio from Honolulu down to small facilities like Port Allen. And before this role, which I think is really integral, and you and I need to talk about this later, she led a $25 million broadband pilot fiber enabling the highway facilities and bringing high-speed internet to underserved communities statewide. Secondly, we have Eddie Galan. Where's Eddie? There he is. So Eddie is a Chief Information Security Officer, or CISO, for the Port of Long Beach. So with over 30 years of technical leadership across Fortune 500 companies in cybersecurity, governance, risk management, and business continuity. So he's built the Long Beach's cybersecurity posture from the ground up. The scale and governance experience this panel is asking him to translate. So we're depending on him to help us figure out how to bridge that also from not just large-scale ports, but down to smaller ports. And then lastly is Gus Hine. Where's Gus? There he is. So he's from our Myriad Office, Maritime Security. So Gus is Gateway Director for the Mid-Pacific region in the U.S. Maritime Administration. So he's responsible for port security, emergency response, and economic resilience across the region. He's also a Navy Reserve Officer and a veteran with staff assignments that have reached from U.S. Pacific Command, U.S. Transportation Command, and the U.S. Pacific Fleet. So please welcome our panel. So we're going to do this because I'm going to be on my feet all day, so I'm just going to chillax too. But yeah, so we've got a short amount of time, and so we've got some questions, and we're going to, I know that I had shared some questions with you all, and I think we're going to try to cover the big ones first, and then we'll circle back and then be able to cover some of the more details. But I guess before we get started, you know, part of this, while this sounds like it's about cybersecurity, I think it's much more about just realizing that every port is connected and it's starting to become even more connected. And so this is really more about the connections that lead to exposure. So a quick question, and I'll just go down the line with each one of you, but the question is, so as every port has more digital connections than most staff realize, even the smaller ones, OT systems that are running cranes and gates, IT systems handling billing, and vendor remote access connections that are running in the background. And I said, before we talk about what we need to think about protecting, from your unique roles and the relationships that you have with your ports, how do you help that port leadership get an honest picture of what they actually have connected right now and the risk that's associated with it? Eddie?
IT and OT are handled a bit different just because of the nature of processing that they do. A lot of it boils down to not I'll say a restrictive thing in regards to you cannot use certain OT systems and such, but you have to understand exactly how it communicates in and out of its environment. Understanding those risks and those different things in regards to either being outwardly facing in regards to internet facing, and the deals as far as either maintenance and updates and such, to the point where you understand how you track that movement and that transmission, gives you a better angle. And if your organization does not have requirements in regards to security requirements, it has to go through a certain standard that needs to follow. If you're following a certain framework and such, follow those methods in a sense. I know sometimes the scale in which, if you're a larger port or a smaller port, a lot of things in cyber are not impossible to do. The thing is, you have to understand that you cannot necessarily have the same tools and such as the bigger ports and such, just because of the nature of resources, et cetera, and the technology involved. But I think it can be scaled. And a lot of things that I always profess to everyone in regards to, well, that's daunting. I don't even have somebody. I have somebody that misses a meeting and I'm assigning them cybersecurity responsibilities. Quite honestly, if you really look at it in the control side of the house, if your hygiene in your organization is at a certain point and you can get those things that you need to have, if you do that, that takes care of about 85% of what you have to do. 15%, and I profess this every single time, 15% is a project and or an RFP to find people that can help you shore up that gap. But each year, it's a transformation. Each year, it's a method of which to go ahead and be able to progress versus standing still. I look at it in a sense that if you stand still, that's terminal for anyone. You have to move forward in some fashion. And I think for me, I love doing outreach because I don't know everything. I do have the experience, but I don't know everything. I like to share, and the consortiums that we have, and from the CISO side of the house, we like to, I don't want to say we like to talk, we like to share. Because as community as a whole is much better, and I know everybody said about partnership and all that, but I think there's nothing that's out of bounds in regards to, for us to share information so that it can help the overall goal in mind. Third actors don't have, they have the luxury of unlimited budget if it's state-sponsored and such, and a limited time. And they have to settle, they don't have rules, left and right limits. We do. So it's better for us to share as much as we can as a whole to preserve kind of the way things should be.
Thank you. Dre?
I think for us at the Hawaii Department of Transportation, until very recently, we've been very lax about how we think about cybersecurity, and that's for a number of reasons. For the most part, I think it's our tenants and our harbor users and our terminal operators that are responsible, for their cranes, their equipment, and their own IT, and so I think we rely heavily on them, doing their part. And I think for us, because we're state government, we sit wholly in the state's IT system, which means, we have, a high level of, security and protection of our network. It means that when I landed here, I was going straight to the hotel room, going to check emails, and I forgot that Guam is considered an international destination, so I had to go through all these approvals, but of course no one was ready to do them when I landed here at 6 p.m. on Monday, because then it's 10 p.m. Sunday, so I had to wait till Monday, right? So we have those kinds of, protections and barriers and what have you. And I think because of those two key factors, we hadn't really thought about it. We're like, someone in the IT office for the state is going to handle it. And I think when we think about our IT staff, they're amazing at buying laptops, and they're amazing at going around the office and saying, hey, you can't connect, just unplug it, plug it in again. And that's who we have, dealing with our cybersecurity. And so in the last couple, I would say year or so, we've made cybersecurity at our ports like everyone's, I'm not gonna say problem, but everyone's responsibility. And for us, what that looks like is becoming aware of other case studies, like what's happening in other ports, what's happening with, private, whether it's on a vessel or in a terminal elsewhere, just so we have that awareness. We've worked with CISA, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, with Homeland Security. They have an assessment. It's not, very onerous. They just kind of walk you through, just so we have some awareness of where we could be vulnerable, even though, we have some protection, through the state IT system. And we had an intern this summer, and I'm like, okay, your one job this summer is to put together a briefing for our staff and just let us know, like, this is, like, make us aware of what's happening. And so I think just driving that awareness is step one. And, of course, don't answer the danger emails.
Thank you. Gus?
Thanks. I know this one's on, so I use it. Thanks for that introduction, Rigo. That was much too flattering. I'm not a security officer, but I am the Mid-Pacific Gateway Director, and I think since I work with a lot of different ports and not any one single port, I can probably provide a little flavor of how MARAD approaches some of these cybersecurity issues. As I was mentioning, we oversee the entire marine transportation system, and it's a system that's very digitally connected. So for us, it's a national security issue, it's a supply chain integrity issue, it's a safety at sea issue, and I think how we try to approach it both through the gateway offices and also through our headquarters and the perspective of the whole agency. It's working with ports about threat awareness, interagency coordination, technical guidance, and funding assistance. And we do work with individual ports. I mean, we issue threat advisories to alert ports to existing risks. We talked earlier about the risks that we see with foreign software programs or cranes. We connect ports, as Dre was just mentioning, with cyber assessment teams, the FBI, Homeland Security, Coast Guard, Cyber Command, CISA. We fund digital infrastructure programs through our PIDP program and modernize legacy infrastructure. And we do work directly with port leadership to build a culture of cyber resilience that promotes actionable mitigation risk measures.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, so my takeaway listening to you all, I was trying to stitch together like what is a common theme? 3 different perspectives, but I think what I took out of it was, get more visibility to your own, kind of like know thyself first, so kind of get more visibility to your own posture and where you have the tools where you can get CISA or others to help you understand where do I currently sit in terms of exposure, at least start to do that, and just become more aware. Like you said, just the awareness aspect, Eddie, like you were saying, just starts to really highlight, and you get the human sensor involved, versus just depending on an IT department to be looking out for everything. Because most of the things that do happen is usually human born. So it's somebody just allowing, clicking something they shouldn't have. But, pulling on a thread that you mentioned, Gus, and talking a little bit about, we'll start to dive into some of that risk, but let's pick on hardware risk to start with. And I think, if we think about Guam specifically right now, but they're excitedly, now the prospects of new cranes is possible, and it's real. And so when we started thinking about, we know there's been a significant amount of federal attention given to Chinese manufactured, port cranes, the ZPMC cranes in particular, and really because of the embedded connectivity that they have. So for ports already operating, and I'm going to start with Eddie real quick, and then Gus, I'd like to get your MARAD perspective on this. But Eddie, for a large port like Long Beach, if there are ports that are already operating this equipment or transitioning through it, and thinking about Pacific ports that are considering new crane procurement, what's the honest risk assessment, you think, and what are practical steps that could be taken to kind of mitigate it?
Understand you go through a bid process and a purchasing power that your organization has. understanding the equipment that you're considering. I believe when you go through, like any RFP, you go and do a RFP process to go ahead and be able to have somebody bid and quote on certain solutions that you're trying to go, giving requirements. But those requirements have to have not just what it does, but what it can do from a technology perspective. How it communicates, as an example, when we started talking about through the Coast Guard, the ZPMC side, what it can and cannot do is transmits all kinds of things. And quite honestly, it's embedded in their software. Nobody, unless you took it apart and actually got the parts and labor and everything else that it does and actually test it out, be able to get the nooks and crannies. A lot of software and hardware, and I'm not trying to insult anybody if you're dealing with hardware or software, but the thing is, they will not give you your code. They will not give you the code to you to analyze. We have the ability to go ahead and be able to do that, but we actually, because we're a landlord port, we go through the Coast Guard and say, look, whatever we can do to emphasize the security aspects of it, whether or not they have dedicated resources or not, I think we have to have a voice in there to be able to do that. And we have that monthly meeting with the Coast Guard, and we do discuss things, and terminal operators and such are there to discuss because we do share that information. And as I alluded to earlier, the whole hygiene piece was critical for that, because when that first came out, a lot of those things that could have prevented at least some exposure, if not all, would have at least had a direct impact if how their hygiene was working. And quite honestly, a study regarding your requirements of what you need and understanding the risks and impacts that it may have if you expose that information as you build it into your ecosystem is the first step. Visibility is visibility. And quite honestly, if you're not dealing with requirements up front, you build it, it's there, what are you going to do about it then? If you have to basically really be reactive versus proactive. So I think, you know, the requirements, and you can gather these things because it'll give you the specs of what it does. If it's requiring self-service in some fashion, if it requires any technology that goes outside or even inside your facility, in your network, I think you have to understand that.
Yeah, it seems like nowadays that's kind of goes with everything that you get. It's like, oh, I tell my kids all the time, just because you want it, like stop for a second and think about what does this mean? You know, because there's consequences with everything, and you're going to buy this and now you can't afford to maintain it, let alone, you know, you don't understand how it's connecting to other things. But Gus, from your perspective, from the red.
Well, I guess without disclosing any classified information, because these are things that come out in public advisories from everybody from FBI to Homeland Security to CISA, but I think one reality remains starkly clear. There are threat actors that are actively targeting, probing, maintaining covert access inside U.S. Critical infrastructure, specifically transportation, maritime hubs in the Pacific. And I think, Rigo, you were mentioning Guam. You know, our Pacific ports, you know, represent vital choke points, both militarily, both commercially, and logistically. And you know, here's what I would ask port leadership, you know, to understand. You know, one is silence doesn't mean safety. You know, don't assume because you haven't received an alert that there's a threat imminent, that there's not a threat, or you haven't been targeted. And, you know, bad actors don't always storm through the front gate. A lot of times they'll try to gain access through, you know, back channels. They'll work through a vendor or work through a VPN or work through a customer. So you have to, you know, remain vigilant. You've got to work with your partners. I mean, in our case, your federal partners, you know, to tap into free threat assessments. I think the Coast Guard and CISA, and probably Gray knows this better than I, but I believe Coast Guard and CISA both offer, you know, free threat assessments if you ask them to come out to evaluate your networks, and every port should be taking advantage of that. And the bottom line is, the Pacific ports, are not facing a hypothetical threat. They're facing active, patient, strategic reconnaissance. And port leadership must shift from the posture of, have we been attacked, to are we resilient enough to keep moving cargo, even if our network is compromised?
Right. No, great point. And one additional point that I'll add my own 2 cents to it is, and I think that there's a difference, especially as we start to get into the islands, where even though ports may be autonomous, that doesn't mean that they're not directly connected to the community, or that you have community systems that are tying into those systems. So the digital network doesn't just end at the fence line of the port, but there are other things that are coming in from the locality, from the local city, the local government that's connecting into it. So it's also about, you could say, hey, we're well protected. Oh yeah, except for, our outside partner is not protected and they're coming in. And so I think that, again, it goes back to that being aware of the bigger picture, just to understand where you might have that risk. So just kind of continue on that thread a little bit about national security. And I think it's really not just national security, but it's also about community security, because it's not just about defending the nation, but also defending our peoples when we get into the islands, right? Islands are islands. And so it's not just about bringing in, steel and bringing in aggregate, but it's also about bringing in food and water, et cetera. And so a question, and Dre, I'm going to start with you on this one. So a lot of, like I mentioned, a lot of the ports, especially across the Indo-Pacific, they're not just commercial infrastructure. They're supporting our critical community and military mobility. But I guess the question is, when we talk about port cybersecurity, in a sense, are we talking about commercial risk management issue, or are we talking about a national security issue?
I think it's a little bit of both. And I think in our port system, that responsibility is shared, as I was commenting a little earlier. I think for us, though, as we, are overseeing the operations in the port, it's making sure vessels can come in safely, and, the berths, our scheduling system remains unaffected. And just how do we continue our operations, and then essentially for the islands of Hawaii, it means how do we continue commerce, right? Because if the ships can't come in and they can't, cargo can't be discharged, right? We don't live, right? Our food, our fuel, everything that you've heard, I think, many of our counterparts from these islands talk about, for the last couple of days, it's these ships, right? Like, to your point, it's not just construction material, right, for, exports and imports, like through a certain state, but this is our lifeline. And so I think the first step for us really is about meeting our staff where they are, so they understand, like, how they, and not just for cybersecurity, but for a number of things. Like, I think our staff, like at DOT, lose sight of how their role plays like this really big part, but they don't see it that way. And so I think it's really having them understand, like, the universe of what's happening and how they do their job, and then making sure they're prepared, to Gus's point about, can we be resilient? Right. And it's not just after a cyber attack, it's after any disruption. So if, hurricane comes and, we take a hit, it's how are we going to continue the scheduling, getting our staff, to continue the work that they need to do without use of a computer. And so actually in Honolulu, our transit system got hit by Russians. It was very 1980s James Bond, where in that office, like, at the same time, every printer printed out the demand notice, right? And so that, they went through some hell getting through that, but it was a very local, not us, but we're like, what did they do? What did we learn? And I think we're taking the time to figure out, if we were in their role, how would we, and so it's all of our user account numbers, we have them on paper. So if we've got to go back to that manual way of doing things, but all of these pieces come together to, one, protect our state's economy and our lifeline, but also like to the national security. Similar to Guam, Hawaii has a significant military presence, and all the goods that support all those establishments come through our port.
Right.
And so we're doing our part to, you know, support the island, including those who are responsible for national security and defense.
Right. You know, I always think about like our problem as you get into the islands is that the problems are no longer horizontal problems, they're stacked problems, right? So you take all of these and you flip it, and if you impact one, it kind of starts touching everything down. There's no way of hiding. You can't isolate it. And so I think it becomes even that much more critical as well. Eddie, from your perspective.
So, and I'm glad Dre mentioned that. I mean, we're one of 18 strategic seaports. We have, of course, what we do as a day-to-day business in regard to port operations, but I'll tell you this, everybody here has a business to run. It is a business. But I was telling Rigo yesterday, myself and my counterpart at Port of LA, we have a joint exercise that we've been doing with DHS CISA in September. Our teams are working together to essentially unofficial reciprocal agreement to basically work together. What happens in my waters is in their same water. Proximity all up and down the West Coast is the same way. So we're trying to not only, I'll say, fine-tune the threat intel that we see and how we share information so that it benefits the whole. And we're planning on, once we have that solidified all the way through, we want to share. We belong to certain groups worldwide that get threat intel very quickly, meaning it may not get to my shore in about 3 weeks. And we leverage all the different agencies involved, FBI, everything else you can think of, all 3-letter agencies. But I like the point that what Gus made in regards to, I'll go back to the same thing, understand the threat that you have and the risks you have in your organization. There's a lot of free, and I say free, programs that they can, like CG Cyber will do that for you and at least give you a roadmap on what your vulnerabilities are and prioritize them in a way so you can, I say, prioritize the effort and resources needed to go ahead and be able to combat that and mitigate that. I think we play a different role in a sense as far as, I know we're on islands here, but we don't live in an island. And I mean that not because the mainland is it's a bigger island. I'm saying we as an organization don't live on an island. I rely on everyone here, whether we are directly connected or indirectly connected, to be able to be those eyes for everyone else here. And that's why I told Gus and Rigo yesterday when we were talking, I love the way that we partner here and we come away with making new friends and being able to see each other and be able to talk to each other. I think the biggest thing that we have to do is there's got to be, like I said, I'll go back to movement. There's got to be one step you have to take. That step will lead you to another step and so on and so forth. It is a journey, it is not. As big as our port is, we have issues that we have to combat with. We're not perfect, we're not vulnerable, we are vulnerable as anybody else, but we'd like to think we have the actions to take to be able to either reduce and or minimize and, matter of fact, get rid of that threat. And I think there's scalability in regards to how you do things, regardless if you're a small port or a large port.
Gus?
Yeah, I think the point about the dual use ports is important because I think that those ports have a explicit obligation to protect national security. But I mean, I sometimes shudder to think of what would happen if, you know, you had a port of Honolulu go down, or the port of Guam. The strategic implications and the commercial implications are pretty drastic. I think Eddie mentioned the strategic ports. I mean, just here in this room, we have the port of Long Beach, the port of San Diego, port of Oakland, Guam, that are strategic seaports. And if there was an incident, a cyber incident of some kind that shut down that port, that's not only going to have incredible economic impact to the nation, but it's going to affect our ability to provide military contingency for operations like sea lift. And you know, we as MIRAD try to tabletop some of this stuff when we work with the port readiness committees, the area maritime security committees, the harbor safety committees. Rigo, I think you and I were talking, or maybe I saw it in one of your questions. We were talking about, you know, our ports. You know, how many of our ports are actually been tested in this regard? But the good news is, through some of these existing committees, we've held tabletop operations. I mean, I've personally we've been at tabletop operations in Long Beach. We've done a whole bunch in Long Beach. Been to Wanimi, been up to Oakland numerous times, but testing out what would happen if there was a cyber incident and how that port would respond to, you know, regain operations. But also, just another note about our kind of responsibility overseeing sort of the marine transportation system. We chair, and I say we as in MARAD, we chair the National Port Readiness Network that bridges commercial port management directly with U.S. Transcom, the Department of War, local port readiness committees, and then through our partnership, as I mentioned earlier, with Coast Guard and CISA and the Cyber Command. You know, we provide, you know, active, you know, vulnerability assessments.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think it's, you know, one thing that I know is as I've continued to myself jump around the Pacific, come to realize, you know, and realistically that national defense, especially as we get out here, economic security is your #1 vulnerability. And so it's, again, kind of that dual use, right? They're both equal. You know, we need to continue to provide directly to the national defense mission to grow that, but at the same time, if the community side isn't being treated equally the same, then you're creating a vulnerability just outside the fence line. And so I think it becomes just equally important. And I think it really does go back to what you guys, both you guys were saying, all three of you, around, you know, doing those tabletop exercises to really just kind of think about those incidents of what would you do, how do we make sure, you know, if we have 3 things happening at the same time, typhoon plus crisis plus this, okay, how do we still make sure that we're getting materials, getting food, getting water, you know, transporting people safely, things like that, all at the same time. And so I think that those become really critical things to consider. And I think just kind of picking on that a little bit, and Dre, I'll go to you first. From an incident readiness perspective, so we think about incidents, you know, so I'm a huge fan that, or I'm a huge believer that from a cyber perspective, we should always be thinking not just about how to be resilient. Resilient is, and I always think about Rocky, you know, like resilient, you get hit and you get up, you know, like that's resilience. But okay, what can we do though, just not to get hit in the first place? You know, like how do we bob and weave so that we don't get hit? And maybe, or at least put up a harder chin so that it doesn't take you down. But I think all that's to say is that when we start thinking about readiness and thinking about if a port's operating system went down today, you know, so whether it be from a storm or ransomware or OT, and you already alluded to this a little bit about having that paper backup, but what would you actually do like in the first 24 hours?
Take out the paper backup. So it's really what I asked our staff to do, right? And this is all in the vein of meeting them where they are, right? Because when you start talking about cyber and everything, people just start freaking out, right? Because it's so foreign to them. It is very like, you know, James Bond, like my 1980s version. But I'm like, if you don't have your computer, how do you do your job today? Right? And so they start thinking about that. And so it's really just starting them to think about, if you don't have your computer, how do you do your work for the next 24 hours? Which then lends itself to answer your question of what do you do that first 24 hours? And it's basically focusing on continuity of operations while you're figuring out what just happened. And you know, maybe it's a, you know, I don't want to say backward way of doing it, but it's really just because we weren't off that paper. It wasn't paper not too long ago. I mean, it wasn't a backup that long ago. We used to do all our ship scheduling on index cards like 11 years ago. So it's not so far in the distant past, but it is really just thinking about, don't rely on your phone, don't rely on your desktop or your laptop, don't rely on the things that, you know, are just commonplace that we, you know, take for granted, but how do we do our jobs without these tools? And what do you need to do to prepare today to keep going? But then, you know, to your thing about like, how do you not get hit? I think just going back to how we started this conversation on understanding your vulnerabilities. Like if you can see where you could get hit, then you kind of know how to like bob and weave in.
So really quick as a follow-up, so, you know, you manage, well, you've got a lot of partners across the islands. Do you think, have all of them been tested? You know, have all of them gone through their own testing, you know?
I mean, some of the partners in the room, and they keep telling me they're ready, so I presume so. But, you know, working with FEMA and our state, you know, emergency management agency and others, like we exercise that. And a lot of the exercise is, hey, your cranes aren't working, then what do you do?
Correct.
And so that is like, you know, our carriers, Matson and Pasha, that's their cranes that, you know, so they've got to figure out how to get those cranes up and running. But for us, it's, all right, if you can't work a ship at the pier where you normally work, do we have somewhere else you can go? Is there, right, what do we need to do? And then, you know, it generates some creativity on our end for, you know, okay, what equipment can go where? If power's down, then how do we move stuff around? So I think the front line on that end is with our carriers, but on the back end, right, we call it in Hawaii a kako thing. It's everybody throwing their hands in and getting it done.
No, and that's a good point. I think when I think about Hawaii, obviously, I think no different than the second island chain, CNMI and Marianas, where we need to be working more as a system of islands, right? Because everything surges, so something happens in, you know, in Tinian or Saipan, and then ultimately they're looking at Guam and going, okay, where am I going next? You know, where am I gonna take all this? I gotta go, I can't keep it on a barge, I gotta go take it somewhere. You know, so you start thinking as a system, and even in Long Beach, I would think, to your point, your partners in LA, right? If something happens in Long Beach, it's like, okay, yeah, we're shutting this down, we're closed, everything's going here, here, and here. But I think what I'm hearing is that front-end planning of like having worked out those conceptual operations, right, for scenario A, B, C, D, and you're right, it is very James Bond, like take out the 3-ring binder and, you know, break the plastic and we're going with this, you know. But Gus, from your perspective in terms of just thinking about, you know, how does MARAD support, like, you know, when there is something like that happens, you know, where you have a shutdown?
Well, I would probably, I mean, if Commissioner Weissman came knocking on my door at the Port of Long Beach, where our office is and where we have 2 MARAD vessels, and said, we've had a major breach, and it's impacting port operations, I'd probably encourage them and take action myself to report it to the National Response Center and CISA and the FBI and Homeland Security, and start to get the interagency family working on it. And then definitely contact the captain of the port for the Coast Guard sector there, and notify the captain of the port, because they'll have a whole threat assessment team that they'll dispatch to try to evaluate what the damage is and the vulnerabilities, and try to help put together a plan to get the port back in action. And then like we were talking about earlier, I think the good news to this is that through a lot of the work that Dre and Eddie and the rest of the port directors are doing here, you know, just being proactive and thinking these things through, having the, as we call them, tabletop exercises. But what would happen if, you know, scenario A, B, and C happen? And I think being proactive, it helps you resolve that and prepare for it.
Right. I'd like to think that every port is ready and has already gone through that exercise. But the reality is that our ports are growing very quickly out here. And so ports that may have just been transporting smaller amounts or, are now being forced to grow to a next level, and this becomes part of that growing pain. But Eddie, I wanted to ask you a question real quick before we run out of time, and really it's, as we start to talk about, learning about what large ports and how they connect to small ports, and really more of that translation, and thinking about actionable lessons, as a CISO, and thinking about, so Long Beach, operates at a scale that most Pacific ports don't. But what lessons, if you were going to say, because you're the first, right? You're the first CISO of Long Beach.
Yeah.
So lessons learned that, if you were going to say, from a cybersecurity posture and you're starting over again, but you're a small port, and you've already covered some of this, but from a governance, is it about governance? Is it about vendor management? Is it about workforce training? Is it about, where's the right start?
If I go back to the first time I actually joined the port, and I don't want to have a perceived notion that the port was not protected during that time before I became the first CISO. The lens in which it was being protected from a cyber perspective was really from a network perspective. I got there, and the cyber lens versus a network or IT lens is very, very different. People mentioned in regards to going back to your paper and seeing that. Whether it's business continuity, disaster recovery. When we did exercises before, when I first got there with the federal government, our own organization looked at cyber as treating it like a disaster recovery and IT event. Well, an IT event is not necessarily a cyber event. And the understanding of that, where we have to eliminate the actual threat that it's a cyber event versus a normal disruption, hardware failure, et cetera, et cetera. That has to get triaged all over the place. I started with, after looking for 90 days, looking and seeing what the biggest risks are to the port. Not only were the resources issue, but also the focus in which we were looking at. The tech stack that we had, layered defense, needed people to actually look and have eyes on glass, eyes on target for that piece. GRC, or governance risk compliance, is a foundational piece to any organization. That's the enforcement piece. That's the one that has teeth to what you're trying to do to protect yourself. I made the joke, I make jokes like this every single time just because I like making jokes, but I've never seen a threat actor say, I'm not going to attack the Port of Long Beach because they have a great GRC policies and procedures. I had to take a look at the tech and really realize what we had to shore up. We have a lot of technologies in place for us. We're very lucky to have these capabilities, but it does not eliminate the resources that we need to be able to study that. With AI and everything else that's going on, we are combating AI with AI because the current tools that are out there are not at the same pace and level to address an AI threat, right? So we have to still have visibility and controls. But at the end of the day, I really do think that if you assess yourself and take a look at what business process you have in your organization and what's a critical most thing that will basically your fault tolerance or your risk and impact tolerance to your organization, you'll learn how to protect those and actually prioritize those different efforts so that you're not just going and putting a tool to replace a problem, right? Software technologies are great. I am an avid proponent for technology, but it has to be scaled in a sense that it makes sense, that there's some checks and balances. We try to eliminate single point of failures. And so those single point of failures will bring you to your knees, and that's the problem that people have to understand so that they can protect themselves as an organization.
You have to understand where the single point of failures are first.
True.
Right?
Exactly.
So it's that front end visibility again of just take a step back and assess and say, holy cow, I didn't realize That's our single point of, because it's usually not what you think it is. You know, that's usually the reality. But I know that we're out of time here. We've probably got about 2 more minutes. So let me really quickly just close and ask you each just a question, and then if you can give me a quick answer. But so if there's something that we could share, and you've shared a lot, and hopefully everybody's taken some notes and things, but if there's one thing that you think from your perspective any port authority in this room could take away, and if you said, hey, if you got to do one thing over the next year, do this. What's your one thing? Gus, let's start with you.
For me, because the APP membership is so diverse, small ports, large ports, coastal container ports, inland ports, that I'd say cyber culture matters at any size of ports.
Nice.
Cyber resilience is the supply chain issues, and bad actors target vulnerability, not organizational charts. So everyone has to be protected.
Nice. Dre?
I would just say start with an assessment, right? Understand your landscape, understand your vulnerabilities, understand your single points of failure, and then of course meet your staff where they are. Because, right, if you come at them with this too technical approach, like no one's gonna do it. And what the message that I've actually given to our staff is we got to make sure that we're not the single point of failure.
Amen. Eddie?
Understanding the value of your data before protecting that data. It's not a one-to-many, or it's not to one-to-one, but you have to understand the risks so you can mitigate.
Thank you. Let's give it up for a panel. Thank
Yes,
you again.
yes. Thank you. You know, we do have time for just a couple of questions. So if anyone has a question, yes.
Thank you so much. Great panel. And I just wanted to put out there, so Dre, kind of the comments you made about kind of where your staff is at, and they're more about the services of IT versus these developments that have happened over the last number of years. Every port is either there or has been there. We were there at one point, even if we've come very, very far, as some of the things that Eddie's described. For example, at one point, Long Beach was there too, right? So I'm really thinking, how can organizations like APP or other ways that we gather support each other in this? I've seen that because, again, as you know, we also run some other businesses like our airport. The airport community in North America has come together in an amazing way around IT. They've created standards amongst themselves, since they are all publicly owned. That's something they can do. They're not government regulation, but standards, and a huge support network. So I'm super thrilled to see this amazing panel and see how, with the federal government and our actual ports, can we come together and support each other, because some of us are very far along, some of us are at the very beginning, some of us are in the middle. So let's support each other, and how do we use an organization like this to do that? I don't know the answer to that, but I just want to put that out there.
So I'm a huge fan, Christy, as you know, of peer exchanges, and would love, for those who were Hawaii years ago, I would love to hear lessons learned, and like, do this, don't do this, or hey, we spent a lot of time here and I wish we hadn't, and we should have focused here instead. And so I don't know what the channel is for that, but absolutely we're open for some of that, let's learn from your learning.
Thank you. Any other questions? Oh, right here.
Thank you. What an excellent panel. What an excellent discussion. A couple of things come to mind is Long Beach is a strategic port, sister port with Guam, and I think this is an opportunity for training opportunities with the Port of Guam. And because we also have an MOU with Atuscum, Guam could be a hub for those type of trainings for cybersecurity, because I know that was an issue also, notably cybersecurity with the Atuscum group, and that it's huge. So we can start with that standardization, something that Christy mentioned. I'll tell you a little story, because when I was in Papua New Guinea, Rory and I were the GM and I were in Papua New Guinea for a big maritime meeting, and this is for every island in the entire Pacific, north and south. And what I heard when we were there was, a company wanting to standardize cybersecurity. And of course, I had to stand up and say, wait, because what's the source? I mean, for the U.S. territories, just like with the French territories, because we had representatives there, we have to consider what the standard is from the national government. So I get it, one size doesn't fit all when it comes to cybersecurity systems, but there's got to be a standard that is recognized and accepted by the United States government, so that way we are standardizing what we purchase, what we apply to our port. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Again, let's thank our wonderful panel.